Hello, and welcome to the program. This is the Black Ponderer. I'm the host, Neil Trotter, and today we're going to talk about some political philosophy. I've been making a string of political philosophy videos as of late, just because that's what I've been reading. And I guess also that's kind of the circles I've been hanging around, doing a lot of community activism, and I've been hanging out with a lot of, honestly, a lot of political philosophers or people who are into that field specifically. And more specifically, I've been hanging out with a lot of anarchists. I'm part of a few anarchist groups, activist groups. And so I've been hanging out with a lot of anarchists. And this philosopher that we're going to be talking about is fairly popular in the anarchist world, right? His name is Max Stirner. Right, and you may have heard of him if you're into that political philosophy, anarchism. He's got quite a reputation. The book that I'm going to be talking about here has been cited a lot by anarchists. It is called The Unique and Its Property, and this translation is by Woolf Landstreicher. Okay, and this book is kind of known, I would say, more. The more popular title is The Ego and His Own, and that's like an early translation, but this is a more modern translation that kind of captures more of the whimsy and the wordplay and kind of more of the comedy that Max Stirner put in this work. That's what the translator says. So this is a pretty popular translation, more modern. Max Stirner is not like the most popular philosophy. He is pretty popular in certain circles, right? Particularly anarchism. And so we're going to be focusing on that aspect of this book right now. What we do here at the Black Ponderer is I just talk about themes that I've read in the book that I find interesting, and then I highlight them, and then I just add my supplementary commentary. We read quotes from the book. That's how we roll. And if you want to continue the discussion, the supplementary commentary, the YouTube comment section is open below, and you can be part of that discussion as well. So like I said, I'm specifically going to be talking about a certain aspect or certain themes of the book. I mean, this book kind of talks about a lot of stuff. It also goes into this philosophy called egoism, which Max Stirner is really big into. Which I think I'll bring that up a little bit. And I think aspects of that will be brought up in the discussion. But I'm going to kind of more focus on the political anarchist idea, even though, Max Stirner doesn't really throw out that term anarchist in the book that much. I think the ideas kind of align well with anarchist philosophy. So I can see why anarchists really get drawn to this work. I would also like to say that somebody sent me this book for free. I was sent this book for free, so it's like, hey, I'll read it. I'll read it. You sent it to me. I've heard about it, but somebody sent it to me, so that's another thing to consider. Always open to get free books to read. Just saying. But yeah, this was sent to me for free, and that's kind of why we're reading it as well, to be honest with you. So thank you for that, person that sent it to me. I haven't forgotten, sent it to me a while back, but now I'm just getting to it, and it's quite interesting. Let's get into it. So Max Stirner has some very critical analysis on religion, specifically Christianity, and some critique, as many anarchists do, right? But he has some specific critiques, and so let's begin our discussion with that. And in case you do have this book, this is page 26. Okay, this is the second line. Even granting that the doubts raised over the years against Christian beliefs have long since robbed you of your belief in the immortality of your spirit, you have still left one tenet unshaken, and you will still cling without inhibitions to the one truth, that the spirit is your better part, and that the spiritual has greater claims on you than anything else. Despite your atheism, you come together with the believers in immortality in your zeal against egoism. Italicized egoism. So the thing is, I will say, like Max Stirner, his language is very flowery, and I don't think that's just due to the translator. I think the translator definitely wanted to capture that flowery speech, which, you know, I'm not the biggest fan of that, but it's cool. I like to speak on layman's terms, you know, try to break it down for the every person. So, you know, what I'm gathering here is, you know, basically the spirit, you know, the spirit equals an ideal. And ideals are hard to destroy, right? You can't, you know, you can destroy people, you can take out certain folks, but ideals linger on, right? And so, you know, Max Stirner recognizes like this spirituality or religion kind of focuses on ideals, and that's what people kind of cling toward. It's not so much the religion in and of itself, it's this idealism, which kind of brings about this immortality that people like, right? And then what's going on is people identify to that immortality, that idealism, and then it gives them this sense of, you know, long-lasting immortality. I mean, that's where we're going here with this, but let me continue. But who do you imagine under the name of egoist? A human being who, instead of living an idea, i.e. a spiritual thing, and sacrificing his personal advantage to it, serves the latter? A good patriot, for example, brings his sacrifice to the altar of the fatherland, but it cannot be disputed that the fatherland is an idea, since for animals with no capacity for mind, or children who are still mindless, there is no fatherland and no patriotism, right? So I put in my notes here in the margins, morality. What is morality? You know, morality equals putting the ideal above the self, right? So it's this idea that I submit myself to the ideal of whatever. Patriotism, you know, is what's being used here, you know, or also religion, right? You know, you subjugate yourself, your being, your true self to this ideal, whatever that may be. And then that becomes your ego. And then you project your ego through that ideal, like patriotism, for example. I'll continue reading. Now, if someone does not prove himself as a good patriot, he betrays his egoism in relation to the fatherland. And so it goes in countless other cases. Whoever makes use of a privilege in human society sins egoistically against the idea of equality. Whoever exercises dominance is chastised as an egoist against the idea of freedom, etc. So you despise the egoist because he neglects the spiritual in favor of the personal, and loves after himself where you would like to see him act from love for an idea. You differ from him in that you make the spirit and he makes himself the central point. Okay, so we're setting the groundwork. So this idea of egoism is like you're putting yourself, you're centering yourself, but you know, the society is like, don't center yourself, center, you know, the ideas, like patriotism, you know, America, United States of America, that's what we'd be centering. Freedom is what we should be centering. Democracy, and then you are an agent that achieves those things. As like Max Stirner is saying, no, I want to live for me, right? I want to live for me, but the society attacks that notion, right? Because the society is like, you don't live for you, you live for the ideals of society. And then I skip down 9 lines. You don't live for yourself, but for your spirit. And what is the spirit's, i.e. ideas? So spirituality, this is my note. Spirituality is the creation of ideals, and morality is deifying those ideals, right? So this is what Max Stirner is saying. Stirner is like, hey, I'll define spirituality for you. Spirituality is just like idealism, essentially. That's what it is, and is replacing yourself with an ideal. That's what's going on here. So okay, got the groundwork set. Let's move forward. Okay, we're on page 32. This is the 9th line. Because he wants to stop being an egoist, he looks about in heaven and earth for higher beings that he can serve and sacrifice himself to. But however much he shakes and chastises himself, in the end, he does everything for his own sake. And disreputable egoism never gives way in him. This is why I call him the involuntary egoist. His effort and care to get away from himself is nothing but the misunderstood drive for self-disillusion. So here's my notes. Spirituality is ultimately egoistic, as the self-sacrifice becomes making oneself a hero. Okay, so it's interesting because there's two ways of looking at this concept. Stirner is saying egoism. It's like there's the egoism of centering yourself, the ego, who you are truly, or what, or maybe you don't know who you are, but you're still centering that thing that you don't know that you are. You're putting that center, or you're centering this ideal, which is the spiritual thing, or this thing that we make spiritual, like patriotism, for example, and then that becomes your ego. And so Stirner says, like, okay, yeah, that's involuntary egoism. You're replacing your ego with this ideal, but it's still a kind of ego, but it's just a placeholder. It's not really you. Okay, this is page 34, and this is the second paragraph, second line. Those who recognize this highest essence together with its own, i.e., with the revelations of itself, are sanctified. The sacred in turn sanctifies its worshiper, who through worship becomes a sacred being himself. As likewise, what he does is sacred, a sacred transformation, sacred thoughts and actions, writings and aspirations, etc. So we define ourselves based off of the ideals that society pushes onto us, and then we get validation from society, and then this becomes like who we are, right? It's not too far-flung of an idea, like, oh, I'm a Christian, that's who I am because, you were raised in the church, these ideas were pushed onto you, you embrace it, and then you get rewarded by the institution of a church. And we could do this with anything, like, let's say philosophy. Oh, I'm a philosopher, right? And so I read really big-ass texts, and then I get rewarded, because people say, wow, you read some really big-ass texts. That's amazing. You really are a philosopher. And then you're like, yeah, I am a philosopher, right? But it's the idea of being a philosopher, not like actually philosophizing, right? So that is it's an interesting thing to think about. It's like there's the ideal of the philosopher, and then there's actually the philosopher. And then, but also, like, Max Stirner is bringing up this idea, like, well, the heck with philosophy. Like, you read the philosophy, but don't read it in this attempt to become a philosopher. Read it just to figure out who you are. Discover yourself, and center your ego. Like, center you. Like, you're not a philosopher. You're just a person being, and you're learning. You're using philosophy to build yourself, right? And you should reject this validation of like, yeah, he's a philosopher. He's like, no, I'm not trying to be a philosopher. I'm just trying to improve myself, right? So or like, it's the same thing with all these other things that Stirner brings up, like patriotism or religion. But let's keep going. This is page 666, and it is the second paragraph. Sometimes people divide human beings into two classes, the cultured and the uncultured. The former, insofar as they are worthy of the name, concerned themselves with thoughts, with the spirit, and because they were the rulers in the time after Christ, in which the principle is thought, they deemed a servile respect for the thoughts that they recognize. State, emperor, God, morality, order, etc. are such thoughts or spirits, which are only for the mind. A mere living being, an animal who cares as little for them as a child. But the uncultured are actually nothing but children. And anyone who only dwells on his life needs is indifferent to those spirits. But because he is also weak before them, he is subject to their power and is ruled by thoughts. This is the meaning of hierarchy. Hierarchy is the rule of thoughts, the rule of the spirit. We are hierarchical to the present day, put down by those who are backed up by thoughts. Thoughts are the sacred. So now we're getting into where anarchists latch on, because it's like, oh yeah, we're anarchists. They're against illegitimate hierarchies. It's like horizontal power. Right? There are no hierarchies, but you have these ideals, the spirituality or the spirit, which is like, Stirner is saying like spirituality is just like idealism. And so you get pushed these ideas, and then now you have these notions of like, well, I'm a better person because I embrace these ideals, and the people who don't, they're worse. So now you have this hierarchy. Like you got Christians and then the non-Christians. You got the patriots, the true Americans, and then you got those who are not American. The cultured and the uncultured. Or you got like, we're going to use philosophy. It's like, well, there's real philosophers, people who actually read the books. And then there's those fake armchair philosophers who just like talk out of their heads, and they're not really doing actual philosophy, but it's just for brownie points, right? And it's for what? But then also like now you have a hierarchy of like philosophers, like, okay, these are the true philosophers, and those are and people like Max Stirner, they're not real philosophers. They're not like Aristotle. So that's the thing. The point that Stirner is making is these ideals that we embrace, this kind of spiritualism, or that's actually a good word. Instead of spirituality is spiritualism, just creates these hierarchies that are not actually useful for human development. Let me continue reading where I left off. But the two are always clashing with each other, the cultured against the uncultured, and vice versa. And indeed, attacking each other not just in two people, but in one and the same person. Because no cultured person is so cultured that he can't also find enjoyment in things, and so be uncultured. And no uncultured person is completely thoughtless. Yeah, so in that way, there's always this sense of self, this ego that always exists, which is being clashed with the ideals of society. Now, even people who embrace the ideals, they're like, yeah, I'm a Christian. But then, of course, you have these conflicting things that don't jive with Christianity, or like being an American, or even like philosophy, for example, right? There's these attributes about you that don't jive with that. They're always existing. So there's this constant clash. Now let's take this to a more social economic angle here. This is page 86. This is the third paragraph. I have won my ownership of the world. All have been handed over to me by my Father. It has stopped being overpowering, unapproachable, sacred, divine, etc. To me, it is godless. And now I treat it so utterly as I please that if it mattered to me, I could exercise every miraculous power that is power of the Spirit over it. And I skip down 3 lines. The world has become prosaic because the divine has vanished from it. It is my property, which I manage as I, that is the Spirit, see fit. And now here we talk about like the property, the unique and its own property. So what's going on here? So there's this justification for acquiring things that you think you shouldn't acquire, but you justify it through these ideals. Like you say, oh, the Father gave me these things. God the Father, manifest destiny. I need to conquer this area. The hell with those people who live there. God has given me the mission to acquire this land. Or you get any type of property, for example, a house or like a big area. It's like, why are you doing that? Well, I have a right to do it. I have a given right. And Stirner doesn't necessarily just focus on holy or godly allocation. He's talking about like, well, we're human beings, and being human, you'd have rights. Right? You have the right to take this thing, and so you're embracing these ideals, and that allows you to acquire things, and the acquiring of things reinforces this idea of self that has very little to do with your actual self. It's just this notion that you've been applied, that that has been pushed onto you, which you embrace because society rewards you with property, and then that property acquisition continues to reinforce that idea of who you're supposed to be, and you identify with that. And then, you know, he talks about like this property has become godless, right? Because again, like there's this clashing, internal clashing. It's like, yeah, but nature is sacred. It's a sacred thing. We can't just exploit nature and just take it and like own it. That's not godly. But then it's like, well, no, because God has given us the right to do it. So this land now is godless because it's for us to take, right? God is somewhere else, right? So it's this constant like clashing, which is very fascinating. It's a very interesting way of thinking about it. This is page 112, and this is the 6th line. Our freedom from another's person still lacks the freedom from the things the other's person can command, from the things he has in his personal power. In short, from personal property. So let's do away with personal property. Let no one have anything anymore. Let everyone be a pauper. Let property be impersonal. Let it belong to society. So what Stirner is saying, and we will revisit this, what Stirner is saying is that the acquisition of personal property, right, that is reinforcing these false notions of self. Like they're reinforcing these ideas of who we are, who are not really who we are, but they've just become who we are. Like, you know, you could say that about anything, what society pushes onto us. I know a lot of people argue with me about my title, the Black Ponderer, and they say like, yeah, you're using this title black to define who you are, and that's this false sense of self. You're not black, don't dwell on that. But you know, I would argue, just like what we were talking about, I read philosophy not necessarily to be a philosopher, but to develop my sense of self and who I am. Likewise, like knowing the history of blackness in his society and how it plays in society helps me navigate through the world and discover better understandings of myself, right? And it's not so much I'm dwelling in the identity of blackness, I'm using the historical context of being black to discover who I am and helping other people discover who they are and our place in society, right? So I would argue that identity is fine as long as you're using it in a way that's progressive and constructive, and like you're really centering your identity on developing on self-discovery rather than just embracing the the ideal society places upon you and then reaping those rewards that society gives you by just flat out accepting it without critically thinking about it. Stirner here is saying like, yeah, we got private property is this thing that just reinforces these illegitimate hierarchies that we use to push false senses of ourselves and kind of block the work that we really should be doing to discover our true selves and learn more about each other and who we are, center ourselves. So we're talking about private property, right? So private ownership or just privacy in general. That's a thing that's very problematic in society, which Stirner is discussing. So how should privacy, or private versus public, how should that be in society to make ways of being human more progressive and constructive and positive? So he talks about this. This is page 129, the second paragraph. What will the society that no longer concerns itself with anything private do? Make the private impossible? No, but subordinate it to the interests of society and, for example, leave it to private will to establish holidays, as many as it wants, so long as it doesn't come into collision with the universal interests. Everything private is left free, i.e. it has no interest for society, right? So instead of society using privacy to prop itself, right? In terms of what do I mean by that? Like, society is not necessarily bad, but societal powers on their own without consideration of individuals, right? Where it just becomes these institutions that just hoard power to like specific kinds of people, where the social institutions just become power hoarding mechanisms rather than like vehicles to drive like individual human prospering, right? That's bad. That's the way privacy functions in today's world, right? It's commodified, right? It's literally like corporations will sell your private data to other companies to like understand your behavior and then sell you products and then do all types of other nefarious things. So Stirner argues social institutions should have nothing to do with your privacy. Your privacy is your privacy. That's a public and private should be separated, right? But that's not how it is right now. I skipped down 9 lines. The fact that the state was a private matter and only dealt with private matters, when the state will finally have the courage and the force to fulfill its universal purpose and to be free, thus when it is also able to give special interests in private concerns their true position, then religion and the church will be free as they have never been before, as the most purely private matter and a satisfaction of purely personal needs. They will be left to themselves. And every individual, every congregation and church community will be able to care for the salvation of the soul as they want and as they deem necessary. Stirner is highlighting this point that the church and religion in general isn't necessarily bad. The reason why it's bad is because it focuses so heavily on your private matters. If it was more just focusing on public concerns, like how do we operate better in public, like meaning like religion should be used to make the public world a safer, more conducive, more positive environment. But what you do on your own, your self-discovery, that's on you. Now, religion can help you with that, but it should not be dictating that. That's something for you to decide. Like it can offer you guidelines, but it should not be dictating, right? And this, I can push this further where the state should do that, right? The state is all up in our business, right? Our personal business, but the state should get out of our personal affairs and rather just focus on public matters. But that's not how these social institutions work, because that's not their goal. Their goal is to create these senses of self that we embrace that just reinforce these social institutions. You see where I'm going with the anarchist angle, right? But let's return to that point about property. How is the power of the self asserted through property? Well, let's read some more. Okay, we're on page 173. This is the 6th line of that paragraph. For now, first of all, we hold our power as a fief from all powerful humanity. And because this power comes from a higher being, it is not called power or force, but rather right, human rights. We further hold our position in the world as a fief from it, because it, the mediator, mediates our intercourse, which therefore may not be other than human. Finally, we hold ourselves as a fief from it, that is, our own value or all that we are worth, for we are worth exactly nothing when it does not dwell in us, and when or where we are not human. The power is humanity's. The world is humanity's. I am humanity's. But I am not at liberty to declare myself the entitler, the mediator, and my own self. Then it goes like this. My power is my property. My power gives me property. My power am I myself, and through it I am my property. So here, this is how it's the unique and its property. We develop our sense of selves through what we own, and it's beyond people talk about this in commodity culture and minimalism and people defining who they are based off of what they own. But Stirner is kind of more is thinking about this in a more holistic, more comprehensive way. I would say it's when you own things, when you own property, for instance, when you private property, legitimizes your sense of self in society. Like society legitimizes you through your property. If you don't have private property, then you are not legitimized in society, right? Look at people who don't own property. People who living on the street, they're invisible, essentially. And through ownership of things, you're able to assert power. That's how you assert your power. You become a homeowner. Okay, now you got all this stuff that you can do that you wouldn't otherwise be able to do if you didn't own property, for instance. The problem is, like, that has nothing to do with yourself, your true self, right? That's the issue. You're just living as, oh, I'm a property owner, or I own this, or I own that. I'm a landowner. But what does that have to do with who you truly are and your sense of self, like your true sense of self? And of course, like, society's like, well, that doesn't matter. Who cares about that? We're giving you all this social privilege. Just play our game, and then we can give you all this fancy stuff that's gonna make you feel good. But at the end of the day, you're lost in terms of like who you truly are, and that's what Stirner is saying. So property gives a sense of uniqueness in society, but like Stirner says, is an involuntary sense of self. It's an involuntary egoist, right? It's not like a voluntary egoist. You're not actually discovering yourself. You're letting society push an ego onto you, which you then accept. This is page 176, the second line. With rights, one always asks, what or who gives me the right? Answer, God, love, reason, nature, humanity, etc. No, only your power, your strength gives you the right. Your reason, for example, may give it to you, right? So again, Stirner's bringing up like, oh, you got all these ideals. What legitimizes you? Like, I have the right to do this. I have the right to do that. Like, where do you derive this? Oh, I derive it from the Bible. No, it's love, the power of love. Everybody has a right to find somebody that loves them, or like reason, like, oh, I'm right because that's the logical thing to do, right? Or, humanity. We're human beings, so all human beings have the right to do this. And so if you're not a human being, then you don't have the right. Let's say animals, right? They don't have the same rights as human beings. But Stirner is like, reject all that. You hold power because you are you. It comes from you. Independent of all these other ideals that is irrelevant. You have the right to do things because you are you. And who are you? Well, it's just up to you to find out. Okay, page 177. This is the second line here. You want to be in the right against the rest. You can't do this against them. You remain forever in the wrong. Since indeed they wouldn't be your opponents if they weren't in their right too. They will always make you out in the wrong. But your right against the rest is a higher, greater, more powerful right, is it not? Not at all. Your right is not more powerful if you are not more powerful. Right. So here, there's this wordplay happening that the translator does a good job with, where it's, rights, like human rights, but also rights in the sense of moral or ethical. And Stirner is talking about like, yeah, you deserve things, you deserve power because of you. But of course, society is going to be like, no, you don't. Like, you can say all that, but look, at the end of the day, if you don't have property, you can't really assert any power. Like, it's just, it's very difficult if you don't play the game. Like, oh, I'm a Christian. Oh no, I'm an American. Oh no, I am a lover. I'm a logical human being. If you're not playing that game, it's gonna be very hard for you to assert your power if you're just doing it just on your own through rejecting all these notions of ego and self. So Stirner acknowledges like, yeah, in our society you can't really do that. So that's why we have all these false senses of self, and like all these people are walking around role playing, embracing these notions of selves that aren't really who they are, and they don't even know who the hell they are. They're just playing this role. This is the third paragraph, the fourth line. What I called my right is no longer a right at all, because right can only be granted by a spirit. whether it is the spirit of nature or that of the species of humanity, the spirit of God, or that of his sacredness or his highness, etc. What I have without an authorizing spirit, I have without right. I have it solely and alone through my power. I demand no right, so I also don't need to recognize any. What I am able to get by force, I get by force, and I have no right to what I don't get by force, and I don't boast of or console myself with my inalienable rights. With absolute right, right itself dies. The rule of the concept of right is wiped out at the same time. As you can see, there's like some wordplay here, which the translator definitely tried to capture. For it is not to be forgotten that up to now, concepts, ideas, or principles have ruled us, and that among these rulers, the concept of right or of justice played one of the most important roles. Authorized or unauthorized, it doesn't matter to me. If only I am powerful, then I am empowered by myself and need no other authorization or permission. So Stirner's just bringing up what we've been talking about. Again, this idea is like, these rights are just given to you because you identify as this thing that society pushes onto you. Well, I'm an American, so I have freedom of speech, I have the right to assemble, I have the right to own a gun, I have the right to bear arms. Like if I live in another country, I don't have those rights. It's because I'm an American, I have those rights, as opposed to Stirner is saying like, look, you have those rights, you should have those rights because of who you are. It doesn't matter if you're American or not, but by society enforcing the concept of we are Americans and we have rights that other nations don't have, so that's what makes us better. Now we've created this hierarchy. Oh yeah, those are bad countries, they don't have the same rights as we do. At the same time, Stirner is saying like, well, it shouldn't be that way, but it is. That's honestly how rights work in our society, which is a shame, but it is what it is, right? So that's what he's saying here. This is an interesting little footnote here. Sometimes footnotes can be very interesting. This is page 10, and this is footnote 269. And here the translator says, it is interesting that in this passage, the word translated as behood is Benentum, is a German word, and the one translated as Germanhood is Deutschtum. From this, what Stirner means by property, which is Eigentum, should become clearer. My property is my ownhood. That is, it is what makes me my own. And what's interesting about that is that last line, my property is my ownhood. That is, it is what makes me my own. So, it kind of drives that point of, what he's saying is like, it's the property that creates this sense of who we are in society. I'm going to read you a set of quotes, and this is basically summarizing his main argument, this whole thing. This is page 233, the fourth paragraph. The revolution directed its weapons against everything that came by God's grace, for example, against divine right, in whose place the human was reinforced. To that granted by the God's grace is opposed that which is derived from the human essence. Now, as the relationship of human beings to each other, as opposed to religious dogma, which commands a love one another for God's sake, had to get its human position through a love one another for the sake of the human being. So the revolutionary teaching could do nothing else as to what concerns the relation of human beings to the things of this world, than to establish that the world, which had up to now been arranged by God's order, henceforth belongs to human being. The world belongs to the human being and should be respected by me as its property. Property is what is mine. Property in a bourgeois sense means sacred property, such that I have to respect your property. Respect for property. Like no trespassing. Why? Because, my property is sacred. And why is your property sacred? Because it's mine, damn it. Because I'm a human being and all human beings deserve land, right? And, it's that type of notion. I put in my notes here. To own property is what it means to be a human, right? Nowadays in society, right? To be legitimately a human being, even though like the vast majority of people in this world can't really afford to own their own property. And so we get a lot of like dehumanizing feelings about that, don't we? You know, like you feel inadequate, like, oh shit, I can't afford my own house. You know, society makes you feel bad about that, like you're not a real person. Because human beings are sacred because God has granted humans the right to own property. Property ownership is the signifier of holiness and sacredness. So it's even like, well, if you don't own property, maybe you should pray to God and maybe God will bestow property on you. And then, you know, if you owed a lot of property, you do horrible things. It's like, well, you know, I mean, that's fine, but yeah, I own property, so God must be doing me a favor. So that, you know, otherwise I wouldn't own this property, right? So it gives you license to do all this fucked up things, right? See where I'm going with this angle, this anarchist angle? This is page 237, the fourth paragraph. Private property lives only by the grace of the law. Only in law does it have its guarantee. Indeed, possession is not yet property. It is only mine by consent of the law. It isn't a fact, un fait, as Proudhon says, but a fiction, a thought. This is legal property, legitimate property, guaranteed property. It is mine, not by me, but by law. Right? So again, like private property is this conception. Like we think like, yeah, we have a divine right to property. Who said that? Well, God said that. Or like, that's what it means to be a human being. Or like, you know, it's fairness. That's the law. That's the law says that. It's like we've just made all this shit up. We denote areas and we designate them to people because that just reinforces society's institutional power. Our property ownership just legitimizes the society structure that we live in. But it really doesn't legitimize who we actually are. Okay, page 238. This is the second paragraph. Only power decides about property, and since the state, whether the state of the bourgeoisie or the paupers or of human beings as such, is the only powerful one, it alone is property owner. I, the unique, have nothing, and am only infode, am vassal, and as such, a servant. Under the rule of the state, there is no property of mine. Right? So really, like, state authority is the God, right? Separation of church and state? I don't think so. I put in my notes. Ultimately, it's divine law, state authority, not humanness that grants property ownership. So, you know, don't be fooled. Like we say, like, you know, this is my divine right. I'm a property owner. It's like that's only happening because the state allows you to own property. Well, I work my ass off and I pay my mortgage and I earned that. You only earned it because the society makes you believe that you owned it because you're just like playing society's game. It has really nothing to do with like who you actually are as a person. That's what Stirner is arguing. So we go at the end of the page. This is the sixth to the last line. Through property with which it rewards the individuals, it tames them. But this remains its property, and everyone has the usufruct of it only so long as he carries in himself the eye of the state, or is a loyal member of society. In the opposite case, the property would be confiscated or made to melt away through embarrassing legal trials. Right? Consequently, property is and remains state property and not property of the I. Because, you know, there have been many instances where the state, you know, people will buy property, they own it, and then the state will come in like, oh, you're gone. Like, this is my property now. That has happened throughout history more often than we like to think that it does. That the state doesn't arbitrarily take away from the individual what he has from the state is just the same as this. That the state doesn't rob itself. Anyone who is a state I, i.e. a good bourgeois citizen or subject as such an I, not as an own I, holds his fief undisturbed. The code puts it like this: property is what I call mine by virtue of God and law. But it is mine by virtue of God and law only so long as the state has nothing against it. Yeah, so again, it's like, you know, I paid a 30-year mortgage and now I own this property. This is my property. No, it's not. It's the state's property. And the only reason why you own it is because you're reinforcing the state's power, right? You're doing the state a favor because you're adopting this idea of self that helps out the state. If you were to someday not do that and not support the state, then goodbye property, right? Your property, and the state would assert itself and be like, okay, time to take back what's mine. And you know, see that kind of thing happen a lot. An example of this happening, right, is when somebody passes away who owns a house, maybe an elderly person, and that person didn't do their will properly, their will and trust, and so the house goes back to the state, even though the family's like, what the hell? My grandma lived here for decades, you know, she owned this house, and the state's like, no, y'all didn't do the will and trust, so it just goes back to a probate, and everybody's surprised, but the reality is that's kind of how property works. So we're on page 241, and this is the second paragraph, second line. The state allows me to utilize all my thoughts and to bring them to everyone, but only as long as my thoughts are its thoughts. On the other hand, if I harbor thoughts that it doesn't approve, i.e. what it can't make its own, then it doesn't allow me to utilize them at all. To bring them into exchange, into intercourse, my thoughts are free only when they are granted to me by the state's grace, i.e. if they are the state's thoughts. It allows me to philosophize freely only insofar as I prove myself as a state philosopher. Though I am not allowed to philosophize against the state, it also looks upon it gladly when I help it out of its deficiencies, advancing it. Therefore, since I'm only allowed to act as I myself, as the state graciously permits, with its certificate of legitimacy and police pass, so too it is not allowed me to utilize what is mine unless that is shown to be its, which I hold as a fief from it. My ways must be its ways, or it will seize me, my thoughts, its thoughts, or else it stops my mouth, right? And, you know, we see that right here in America with this outlawing of freedom to protest and assembly. Currently in my city, for example, the area where I live, the South, Tennessee is the state I live in. You know, you organize a protest, and then you know you're gonna get like tear gassed by the cops, for example, because you're just asserting your right to assemble and protest. You get tear gas, so you'll start buying some personal protective equipment, some PPE, like some gas mask and some knee pads, some hardy clothes to protect you. Maybe you might get bopped by the cops just because you're just voicing your opinion, right? This happens, and that's becoming illegal. Like, people are buying personal protective equipment to protest, and they're getting raided, and they're being charged for like treason or whatever, you know, some like law they're violating, right? So you can voice your opinion, but only if it suits the status quo of society, right? I mean, you're seeing it even in the United States of America. You know, let's not talk about other countries, right? But, you know, we could also talk about this in regards to like YouTube, right? You can be monetized. You can monetize your videos, but you can't say certain things, right? Certain things you can't say. It is not just like being sexually explicit or like incredibly violent. No, you can't bring up certain topics. You don't really have freedom of expression if you want to be monetized. Fortunately, I don't monetize my videos, so that I don't care about that. But the state power, the corporate power, is not rewarding me. Like, you're not going to see me have that silver plaque or whatever, because YouTube's not going to push my videos to lots of people because I say things that aren't advertisement friendly. Right? So I'm not getting rewarded, right? Same scenario. The state has nothing to be more afraid of than my mouth, and there is nothing that it must try more carefully to prevent than every opportunity that may come to me to make a worthwhile use of myself. I am the mortal enemy of the state, which always hovers between the alternatives, it or I. Therefore, it pays strict attention not only to not letting me count, but also to thwarting what is mine. Right? So again, now we're talking about anarchism. Anarchists are like, yeah, that's what I'm talking about. Then you can see how like a lot of anarchists will gravitate toward what he's saying here. In the state, there is no property, i.e., no property of the individual, but only state property. I have what I have only through the state, as I am what I am only through it. My private property is only what the state leaves to me of its own, and it cuts off the state members from it, makes it private. It is state property. Okay, let's continue. I skipped down 3 lines. What do I do if my ways are no longer its ways, my thoughts no longer its thoughts? I look to myself and ask nothing of it. In my thoughts, which I get sanctioned by no assent, no permission, no grace, I have my actual property, a property with which I can carry on trade, because as mine, they are my creations, and I am in a position to give them away in return for other thoughts. I give them up, and in exchange for them, take others, which are then my newly bought property. What then is my property? Nothing but what is in my power. I skip down 3 lines. That over which I have power, that others cannot snatch from me, remains my property. Well then, let power decide upon property, and I will expect everything from my power. Yeah, I put in my notes here. Meaningful property is property that is actually of one's own, independent of the state. That is property of the other definition. Attribute, one's own characteristics. Right? Discovering yourself, right? You know, the other definition of property, you know, property, the property of a thing, like the characteristic, the attribute, the aspect of a thing, right? That's a property too. That's a unique and its property. What makes something unique is like discovering who you are, right? So there's some more wordplay. There's that way of looking at it too, which is the right way in terms of what Stirner is saying, or like the way in which is conducive to human development. And I say, like, yeah, the power to self-actualize, you know. And how do you self-actualize? Well, you find certain parts of who you are. You discover parts of yourself. You find that might not necessarily align with what society is telling you who you are, but you're discovering these properties of yourself, and that makes you unique. And then you develop power based off of that, which could be counter to state power, right? Which becomes an issue because now the state is not rewarding you, and it, you know, could harm you. But there is some power there that you can get from a different kind of property, not like property awarded by the state, but your own property, your own individual property, your characteristics, your attributes, your aspects. Let's keep going here. This is page 259, 3rd paragraph. Still, only the individual's unique force, which is solely his own, gives them, so to speak, life and meaning. That he doesn't administer his office like an ordinary person, but puts in the capabilities of his uniqueness. He is not yet paid for this when he is generally only paid as an official or a minister. If he's done this to get your thanks, and you want to preserve this thanksworthy force of the unique, you can't pay him as a mere human being who performed only human things, but as one who accomplishes the unique. Do the same with your labor. It isn't possible to determine a universal valuation of my uniqueness as it is for what I do as a human being. Only for the latter can a valuation be determined. Go on then and set a general estimation for human labors, but don't rob your uniqueness of its deserts. Human or universal needs can be satisfied through society. For the satisfaction of the unique needs, you have to do some searching. Society can't provide you with a friend and some friendly service, or even an individual service, and yet in any moment you will be in need of such service, and on the slightest occasion need someone who is helpful to you. Therefore you don't rely on society, but see it that you have the means to purchase the fulfillment of your wishes. I put in my notes here. What is unique to you is transcendent. It is the metaphysical property that we can make physical to derive true meaning. So, you know, what makes you your uniqueness? It's, you know, Stirner says it's beyond human being. Like, you know, we have these notions of what it means to be a human, which society tells us, but really, like, what makes you is beyond that. It's transcendent of that. So in a way, it's kind of like metaphysical, but you make the metaphysical physical by embodying those true aspects of yourself. And that's power. This is page 261, second to last paragraph. My property is not a thing, as this has an existence independent of me. Only my power is my own. Not this tree, but my power over it, or my capability to dispose of it, is what is mine. People say I have a right to this tree, or it is my rightful property, so I've gained it through power. That the power must persist is that the tree must also be held, or better, that the power is not a thing existing in itself, but has existence only in the powerful. I. In me, the powerful one is forgotten. Power, like my other characteristics or properties, right, such as humanity, majesty, etc., is elevated to something existing in itself, so that it still exists long after it has ceased to be my power. Thus turned into a ghost, power is right. This immortalized power doesn't even expire with my death, but rather is transferred or bequeathed. That's interesting, right? Because just like we were talking about with the ideals, they don't die either. They just keep going. Well, actually, you can reject that and find true notions of yourself, true aspects of your ego that also don't die. They're also immortalized. Right? I'll continue though. Things now actually don't belong to me, but to right. On the other hand, this is nothing more than a delusion because the individual's power becomes permanent and a right only by others combining their power with his. The delusion lies in their believing that they can't withdraw their power again. Again, the same phenomenon that the power is separated from me. I can't take back the power that I have given to the possessor. One has invested power, has given away his power, has renounced thinking better of it. A property owner can give up his power and his right to a thing by giving it away, squandering it, and the like. And couldn't we likewise let go of power that we lend to him? So Stirner is talking about that power goes back and forth. Yeah, your power is immortal. No, it's not. But it is. No, it's not. It just keeps going back and forth. And like what he said at the last part, where it's like, the state gives you the power to own property. Well, that is a power that the state has that's given to us, and we could reject that power. And by rejecting that power that the state had that was supposed to be given to us is now not there anymore. That's how we defeat it, by rejecting this notion of private property and like focusing on like ourselves and that kind of thing. But that only can go so far, right? So it's kind of this dialectical thing, right? If you want to get all Hegelian about that. But it gets deep. It gets deep, and okay, we'll end it here. Like that'll be the end of the discussion in terms of like this anarchist angle. Now there's more to. Oh, my light turned. The little plant light turned off. Well, I guess it's a good sign to say, this is the end. Lights off. There's definitely more ideas in this book. The unique in its property, but we just focused on like kind of the more anarchist stuff and socioeconomic, political stuff. I would encourage you, if you really want to get in the deep end of like anarchist philosophy, like really start getting into the theory of it all, you can really start getting into the weeds, and then you can really start having really theoretical conversations with anarchists about this, which I'm not a huge fan of. I kind of like being more practical, but it's very interesting take. And it makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense. And thanks for the person that gave this to me. That was awesome. Now I'm in the know. Now I'm in the know, and I can talk theory with my anarchist friends while we destroy the state. That'll be nice if we could do that, but that's not happening because we're not powerful enough. But we do what we can to give power to the people. We do what we can. We do what we can. Anyway, you've been watching The Black Ponderer. Tune in next time for more philosophical thought.